excited for tonight's talk. I get to introduce Katie. I just want to say that we will be heading over to the gallery after this. And there wasn't a tour scheduled, but I feel like we're going to have a great tour between Katie and I tonight. But really we're here for Katie's talk. Katie is the curator of collections here at A&H. She's been here for like 7 years. The wonderful thing about tonight's talk, my favorite thing, is you're going to hear about André's term toodles. I thought it was like a term of affection for like somebody in his life or his dog or something, but it actually is a very serious term he uses for how he discusses modernism, so we're all going to learn about toodles. And we'll learn about how André's, one thing we really was kind of fleshed out in this exhibition was that André's life is the arc of modernism, and how modernism comes into being, and what the effect is when modernism comes over to the United States, and then the effect on the artists here in the United States. So we're looking forward to Katie's talk, so please welcome Katie Benson.
André Smith to the movement. Like Dan prefaced, André Smith's life, really when he was born, modernism was kind of already on the rise, and when he became an artist, he kind of fell through all of these movements and finding his own way into artistry that really lines up for modernism. So this talk was really fun to put together, probably because of the toodles, some new information that we get to share, and also because I think it's a really unique way to look at the history of modernism through our wonderful founder, André. And before we move on, I would like to point out this wonderful Cora doors here. This is, I don't know the date, but this is a newspaper clipping that André actually cut out and put in his scrapbook, so he clearly very loved it too. Miss Doris is looking at one of his paintings, which we will later find out is considered a toodle, and she's saying, anyway, it's interesting. And I think that's a good preface for the talk as well, and we're going to talk about the history of modernism. You know, when you have a job like mine, and you study art history, you study all this history, the history books just tell you, well, then modernism started at this date. But in reality, it wasn't like, the newspapers that day printed out, and we're going a different direction, everyone. It took time. The term modernism, the term, impressionism, all of these, it took time for really the public to understand. It was really the artists that were kind of on the forefront. So this just really good for Cora. At least she showed up. So, that's one step. Okay. So modernism emerged during the period of extraordinary upheaval. The Industrial Revolution, with its factories, railroads, electricity, and photography, had changed the way people lived and understood the world. Artists no longer felt bound to tell religious stories or provide literal, realistic depictions of their subjects. Instead, they began to search for new ways of seeing and new ways of expressing the rapidly changing conditions of modern life. And into this movement of artistic reinvention was born J. André Smith in 1880. And here is André Smith with our wonderful benefactor and founder in her own right, Mary Curtis Bok. André Smith was trained as an architect at Cornell University, and his career began in a world where academic precision and tradition still held sway. Yet over the course of his life, his work would evolve dramatically, shifting from architectural etchings and carefully composed cityscapes to expressive monotypes, abstract experiments, and even subconscious, dreamlike imagery. What makes Smith such a fascinating figure is the way his artistic journey mirrors the larger story of modernism itself. A move from tradition towards experimentation, from external description toward inner vision, and from outward order toward creative freedom. During this lecture, we'll trace that story, looking at the rise of modernism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and examining how those currents profoundly shaped Smith's work from his early etchings to his experimental toodles and beyond. So the roots of modernism. Before the 19th century, artists were often commissioned by wealthy patrons or powerful institutions such as the church, and much of their work depicted religious or mythological scenes designed to instruct, inspire, and reinforce shared beliefs. During the 19th century, however, many artists began to take a new approach. Instead of working primarily for patrons, they created art based on their own personal experiences and subjects of their own choosing. This shift marked the beginnings of what we now call modernism. In the late 19th century, these ideas came to the forefront with movements such as Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and Symbolism. Each challenged artistic conventions with increasing boldness, paving the way for the avant-garde. And pictured here is the Impressionist artist, give me a minute, it's a mouthful, Raffaelli, nailed it, in his studio. And Dan and I were actually looking at this picture earlier, and we kind of noticed something interesting about it that goes with the talk of what we're saying here. So he's an Impressionist artist. Obviously, Impressionists were paving the way for modernism at this time and kind of finding a new way to approach their painting. But if you look at this picture, it's still very kind of old school, gilded frame art historical. So I think this is also a good example of their thoughts were going forward, but they were still very much in a standardized world. So the world had to really catch up to them. André Smith, isn't he handsome? Julius, we didn't know that was his first name, but here we are. He always knew he wanted to be an artist. His family, however, worried that the precariousness of such a career and urged him towards a more practical path. And yielding to their concerns, Smith studied architecture at Cornell University. I will point out, it's one of my favorite typos. They say that he landed in the College of Agriculture. It would be a very different museum if that was true. I just find that funny, because he worked on the yearbook, so he apparently just didn't edit his own description, which is great. Yeah. But still, he never abandoned his artistic ambitions. He served as artistic director for the Cornellian and the Cornell Yearbook, not very well. And he also contributed to the Cornell Widow and the Cornell Alumni News. He exhibited his paintings at the university and in New York galleries, and he even taught himself the demanding craft of etching.
Maybe they had Google autocorrect in it.
Maybe, that's true.
He put art down and it kept turning it back.
They kept going back and forth, yeah, exactly. In 1904, Smith was awarded a 2-year traveling fellowship from Cornell's College of Architecture. This opportunity allowed him to spend several months each year in Europe. I think it was about 4 months he got to spend in Europe, which is a really great deal. There, he encountered the early currents of avant-garde movements that emphasized the artist's inner vision and emotional response over faithful descriptions of the external world. This stood in sharp contrast to the dominant traditions of Western art, which sought to depict the observable physical reality. That's another thing that we'll see throughout this lecture is America was just a little kind of lagging a little bit behind of Europe. So, Andre had this really amazing opportunity to go over Europe. He was seeing all these amazing things and would come back and would kind of be like, wah, wah. We're not really going anywhere. And then this is a picture of him in Europe with his friend and fellow etcher, Ernest Roth. I just love how dapper they are. Yeah. By the dawn of the 20th century, modernism had become a driving force that would reshape the art world. And this is a wonderful painting by Espero that was made in 1903. So this is the kind of art that artists were making when André started to go over to Europe for the first time. Okay. By the start of the 20th century, the art world was in the middle of an upheaval. New technologies, especially photography, were changing the very purpose of art. Portrait photography, for instance, became affordable and widely available, framed painters from the expectation of strict realism. If a camera could capture an exact likeness, artists were finally free to pursue something different: emotion, abstraction, and the inner life of their subjects. We have 2 great examples on here. We have the Van Gogh. The inner life of your subjects is really, poignant here, and then this also wonderful portrait down below. This was the moment when the avant-garde truly began to take center stage. In Europe, movements like Expressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, and Futurism burst forth, each challenging long-held artistic conventions. The word avant-garde itself comes from a military term meaning front guard. They're like the Marines of, what we consider Marines. So they always go into war first. And artists at this time, they began to see themselves as being on the front lines of cultural change, pushing boundaries, defying traditions, and imagining entirely new ways of representing the world. I found that fascinating. For American audiences, one of the most dramatic introductions to these radical ideas came in 1913 with the Armory Show in New York City. This is an ad that was posted in the New York Times in 1912, so the year before the Armory Show, and it just shows you, again, the artists are yearning for something more. The public's maybe not really there yet. So one artist, I guess, decided to put in this ad. It says, "Artists in revolt form new society, dissatisfied with present methods of Academy of Design and its plans for future, want open exhibitions. American painters and sculptors aim at developing broad interest in American art." I assume that they paid per word, that's why it's so, short and distinct. But again, it shows you, I just want open exhibitions. So again, it shows you the want and the need, but the rest of the society hadn't quite caught up. But in 1913, we had the Armory Show. This exhibition brought works by European modernists, artists like Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, Marcel Duchamp, and Vasily Kandinsky into the American spotlight. Viewers were shocked, confused, and sometimes outraged. Duchamp's nude descending a staircase was famously mocked in the press, but the show also planted seeds that would shape the next generation of American artists, including J. André Smith. Speaking of André, so where was he during all of this, that, this changing of the art movement was happening? At this time, Smith was beginning to shift away from his architectural training. He had earned degrees in architecture from Cornell, and he had started a practice with a fellow classmate, Sid Ross. But by 1908, Smith was drawn back to art and started teaching himself how to etch. He was a quick learner and swiftly mastered the complexities of etching and printmaking, and his prints quickly gained recognition. Here we have some wonderful examples of his prints around this time. Smith absorbed both the technical rigor of architectural background and the creative ferment of European art scenes, which were the main focus of his prints at this time. His etchings of Venice, especially show the intricacies of Smith's skill and passion for his craft. But Smith, much like the world around him, began to bore the traditional ways of expression and started to experiment. In 1912, Smith created a series of monotypes he called Records of Emotions. These works were strikingly different from his earlier carefully rendered city scenes. They were expressive, experimental, and even dark. And I'm sure you're wondering, how different could it be? Well, very different. And again, this is in 1912. This is the one of the series that we have in our collection we unfortunately don't have anymore. If you just happen to see one, bring it back, that'd be great. But in speaking of this series in an essay, Thomas W. Leavitt also acknowledges an artistic shift in Smith when stating, "On his many travels during the years preceding the First World War, he must have come in contact with the artistic ferment in European art centers, for his work took a rapidly experimental turn. In startling contrast to his highly finished European scenes, the wildly expressionism of these prints recalls the late fantasies of Goya." Which I think you can kind of get that when you look at these too. In 1914, Smith made a decisive move, and wrote to his friend Oscar Vitae, we'll talk more about him, that he was to leave the field of architectures behind and declared himself an artist. In 1915, Smith showed his records of emotions at the next year Armory show in New York, had a series of etchings purchased by the Library of Congress, and also entered in 15 etches to the Panama Pacific International Exhibition in San Francisco, where he won a gold medal for his work. So that's a really quick turnaround to be like, I'm not gonna be an architecture, I'm an artist, and then to have that rapid success. What's so significant here is that Smith's personal shift mirrors the broader explosion of modernism. I lost the mouse, hold on. Here we go. Smith's personal shift mirrors the broader explosion of modernism. Just as artists in Europe were breaking away from realism, Smith was leaving behind the measured lines of architecture. Just as modernists were experimenting with abstraction and expression, Smith was exploring the raw emotional potential of printmaking and beyond. In other words, Smith wasn't just watching modernism unfold, he was swept up in it. His life and work became part of this larger story of artistic reinvention. That brings us to World War I and modernism. The outbreak of World War I forced modernism into entirely new territory. Suddenly, technology was not just a tool of progress, it was a weapon of destruction. Machine guns, airplanes, tanks, and chemical warfare shattered old assumptions about civilization and humanity. Artists, too, found their work reshaped by the war. Again, André being very dapper in his uniform. One fascinating connection between camouflage and the avant-garde is their similarities in the realm of modernist experimentation with figure and ground relationships. Surrealism, with its fluid conceptions of identity, certainly was influenced by theory and practice of military camouflage. Cubism also shared connections with camouflage, as both reversed traditional academic technique by confusing the distinction between figure and ground, flattening three-dimensional spatial relationships into two-dimensional patterns. In 1917, Smith enlisted in the Army Reserve and soon to join the Camouflage Corps of the 40th Engineers. Smith and others in the Camouflage Corps focused on new concealment tactics, experimenting with altering figure-ground relationships, mimetic deceptions, and concepts of identity. These experiments not only aided in the war effort, but also influenced Smith and other artists. So on the right side is a drawing of Smith that he did in an article about his time in the camouflage unit. And then on the left side is a French artist who became a cubist, and he was also in the French camouflage unit. And that was one of his designs. So you can see really the verging into cubism and surrealism in these sketches. By 1918, Smith was then chosen as one of the only 8 official war artists to serve with the American Expeditionary Forces in France. During this time, Smith documented the war with the unique lens of soldiers in their downtime and what happens to landscapes after war. In 1919, Smith published his book, In France with the Expeditionary Forces, which combined his talents for draftsmanship with his modernistic interest in recording the psychological weight of the battlefield. In reading some of his letters from the war, we found out that, the government was really looking for propaganda during this time. They wanted to see, the fighting, they wanted to see the warfare, and André was like, no, thanks. I'm not gonna do that. So as you see in these 2 pictures here, he documented again, so soldiers in their downtime coming through cities, and then also just the destruction of war in itself. So even though these are still realistic depictions of these scenes, he's choosing the emotion and the feeling over the reality of the landscape. Yes?
That picture you showed us before that you said is no longer in your collection, that real fiery thing.
Yes.
Wasn't that a reflection of war by André Smith? Did I read that somewhere, or am I mistaken?
I don't think it's a reflection of war. It was done in 1912, so it was before he was in World War I, but I do think it was a reflection of, it was an experiment of going through emotions and how you can express raw emotion through artwork without it being representational.
Okay, thank you.
thank you for the question. After the war, the art world changed yet again. In 1924, the first Surrealist Manifesto by André Breton was published, and many artists began to follow the Surrealist movement and its determined exploration of ways to express in art. Sorry, I wrote that down wrong. The exploration of ways to express in art the world of dreams and the unconscious. At the same time, Smith's life was drastically changed as well. In 1924, Smith's leg was amputated during an injury he had suffered years prior. During Smith's convalescence, he again turned to art and created beautiful sketches of a town named Espero, which you can see on the screen now. These sketches accompanied an article Smith wrote for the Architectural Record in 1926, which he called Sketches of Espero. And it detailed a city that is overwhelmingly full of sketchable material that only existed in Smith's mind. He completely made it up. The city, not a real place, which when you look at his etchings and his drawings is remarkable. You know, it's one thing to create a story of a not real place, but it's another thing to create, you know, cityscapes of it. And also the article detailed, you know, each of the sceneries and like what people did there and who worked there. So it's very detailed. And the city was his hope and his dream of something more to come. And another thing to note is that he called it Espero. Some of you may know about 10 years later when he opened up the research studio, he called it Espero too. So in 1926, he was going through a lot. He, lost his leg. He was trying to figure out, his life moving forward, and dreamt of this place where people could congregate from all walks of life and create and just be happy, which really is what he created with the research studio. So it's some foreshadowing, if you will. By 1929, Smith began experimenting with what he affectionately called toodles. So these toodles are a very, very recent understanding to us. We were fortunate to get a hold of some letters between André Smith and his good friend from college, Oscar Vitae, who was also an architect. And their friendship lasted over 50 years. They're very good friends. And they wrote each other maybe like once or twice a week, to the point that a lot of the letters are, "I haven't heard from you. Why haven't you written me back? You can't be that busy." It's kind of like, just needy, but very close friendship. And what I've noticed when, reading through them is that because it's such a close friendship, that André tended to be a little bit more forthcoming as far as his artistic interests and where he was going. In fact, when I mentioned that André in 1914 announced that he was leaving architecture, that was in a letter to Oscar. He was like, just letting you know. He didn't actually leave his architecture firm for another few years, but that was a friendship of Oscar always knew kind of up front. And I kept coming across this word toodles, which honestly made me giggle for a little bit because it's just kind of a ridiculous word. And we'll get into more of what André thought of it, but really what it kind of stands for is his word for modernism. Again, these movements weren't, published in history books and like, this is what we're doing from now on, all artists fall in line. These artists that were interested in modernism, they probably didn't call it modernism. They probably called it, toodles, anything that you kind of could think of. And so what we've discovered is that these toodles were really his experimenting into modernism. And they started out with, you see this wonderful painting, kind of crazy. This is one of André's works here. And they started off very similar to these, but in small little sketches that he would send to Oscar in his letters. And he was just basically trying to figure out new ways to depict the world around him based on emotions, based on distorting your point of view in the eye, and just based on different ways of looking and making art itself. But to get into his more technical terms for it, To him, these were experimental, improvisational drawings and etchings that pushed towards modernism. He described them as concentrated visualizations that distilled memory, emotion, and structure into new forms. For Smith, the Toodles represented freedom, art as exploration, not replication. Here is a great quote. Again, this is a quote that he wrote to his best friend, Oscar. I don't talk to my best friend this way, so I'm kind of in awe of that. But as he says, I am far too deeply interested in my concentration Toodles and light experiments to see the old things in their calm, orderly, or disorderly way. Excuse me. I'm making small drawings, which have held my interest for the last few years and have resulted in my last year's etching, Madonna, Man of Sorrows, and Biot. I did not pronounce that correctly, so sorry. And others along this line. This is the Madonna work that Smith was referencing in that last quote. So, some things you may notice about it. They're not abstract doodles. You know, you can still kind of guess. You understand, you know, who this is depicting because of the halo, because of all these kind of characteristic art historical references, but the detail is kind of left out, and you're left with more of his interpretation of the Madonna as Mary in just kind of a simplified form. A better way to describe the evolution of these Toodles is to look at his former etchings of European scenes to his more Toodleistic etchings. He did use that term, it's hilarious. Transitioning to Toodles. So this is a really good example. We have two etchings of the same hill town in Segovia. It honestly looks like the same vantage point that he was stemming from. But as you can see, the one on the left is called Hilltown of Segovia, the Old Manor, and the one on the right is Hilltown of Segovia, the New Manor. So this he considered very Toodly. These were Toodle works. And he was able to develop a style of art making that he continued experimenting with for the rest of his life. And also he kind of came to a head because his dealers, when they saw this, they were like, whoa, 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 this is not the stuff that we've been selling before, to the point that they refused to sell his prints. So he was, you know, again, moving forward. He was seeing these other artists in Europe inspiring him, but there was a stalemate there. He couldn't move forward like he wanted to. And these new works were clearly different from the detailed and realistic European prints he was originally known for. In describing this shift, Smith stated that he created etchings which were not mere souvenirs of visual experiences, but were, in a way, experiences in themselves. I love that. Here's another wonderful quote by André, where he's describing his approach to these. So, caught in the play of lines and planes and intervals, I feel that the eye is persuaded to discard its habit of reasoning sight in order to lose itself on the contemplation of what might be called an orderly confusion. By the use of mass spaces, or merely with a free-flowing line, I have played upon the surface of the plate, composing, improvising. In 1935, Smith, he even though his dealer was not buying his works, that didn't stop him, even though there was maybe a stalemate in as far as his works being purchased for a profit. He said, it's fine, I'm gonna still move forward. And by 1935, he began a series of watercolors that were, in his words, sort of surrealistic and extremely Toodlesque. Love that. Toodlesque. While Smith had a difficult time smelling, that would be difficult. While Smith had a difficult time selling his new prints to dealers, the art world still took note of the modernist shift. And in 1936, the Museum of Modern Art displayed four of Smith's works during their fantastic Art Dada Surrealism exhibition. This was a big exhibition. Salvador Dali was in it, Georgia O'Keeffe was in it, Walt Disney was in it. This was, I'm not sure if MoMA knew at the time that this was the who's who of modernist, movement at that time, but they certainly were on some sort of correct track. And in the following year, Smith published 38 of these paintings in Art in the Subconscious, which was printed here at the research studio. So this is one of the works that André exhibited in the show, and then this is what the show. Look how far we've come in, gallery design, though. They were just like fantastic art, data, surrealism. Whatever, no commas. It's fine. People will come.
They didn't have Jandettes.
They didn't have, that's what they were missing. Exactly. If only. But what we see here is a Smith who was constantly testing the limits. He was moving between realism and abstraction, observation and imagination, and he was not tied to a single style, but rather embodied the restless experimentation at the heart of modernism. The later years. By the 1940s and 50s, modernism had splintered into multiple directions. In architecture, simplicity and formalism defined the era. In painting and sculpture, abstract expressionism rose to prominence in New York, cementing the city as the new center of the art world. Finally, America caught up. Smith, now at this point based in Maitland, Florida, he continued to chart his own path. His toodles became more intricate, sometimes surreal, sometimes abstract, and often automatic, as they flowed directly from the subconscious onto paper. Smith also worked in cement sculpture, as we all are very well acquainted with, and he integrated his architectural background with his artistic vision. In 1946, Smith's toodles brought him to a new artistic direction in the form of magic realism. Similar to his Art and Subconscious series, although painted in oil and much larger works overall, these magic realism works allowed Smith to again play with artistic reinvention. In describing this new series to his friend Oscar again, Smith explained, "They are disturbing and also amusing and a bit creepy in subject matter. Yet in all of them, I am trying to make the unreal seem real." He continues by saying, "But being a fair mystic on my own, this matter of reality and unreality is open to considerable doubt. That is, which is which?" Very artsy thing to say. So this is one of his magic realism works. A reason that I'm showing it with you is, one, it's a staff favorite. We affectionately call it Skeleton Yard Sale, which is not its title, but that's what it will be known forever. And while we've loved this work, there's always been some kind of mystery around what exactly is happening. But with the understanding, the loose understanding of magic realism, we said, are we even supposed to understand? But again, these letters to Oscar, André decided to explain it completely. So I will share with you these quotes. They're a bit long, but I find fascinating. André says, "One of the subjects that I just painted was based on an actual but almost unbelievable scene and only a stone's throw from the back of my studio in Connecticut, not here. Here, in front of a small shack, has been piled all the dead furniture that was taken out of a hotel here that is being demolished. Mountains of overstuffed and badly faded sofas and chairs and all the odds and ends of junk that has been in a hotel that has stood unused for at least 25 years. Ugh. I can't tell you the effect of this confusion set against the front of the small yellow shack that could not hold a tenth of its overflow." So again, Smith's letters to his friend Oscar from this time period reveal both excitement and frustration. He was thrilled by the freedom of experimentation, but was also dismayed at how cautious and conservative many American artists and patrons remained compared to their European counterpoints. Again, especially in the South, in Florida. As we all know, he had very strong opinions on the artwork that was being shown at that time. So much so that he built his own museum. In his words, too many clung to the normal rather than daring to experiment. Despite this, Smith persisted. His research studio in Maitland became a hub for artistic exploration, a place where he and others could push boundaries without fear of convention. In many ways, it was his gift to future generations, a physical space dedicated to modernist ideals of freedom, experimentation, and innovation. So what does this all mean? In conclusion, modernism gave Smith and other artists permission to break away from formal training and pursue art in a more personal and expressive way, and he helped bridge European avant-garde ideas with American audiences. Now I say that's kind of a grand statement. You know, it wasn't like he was like, everyone listen to me. I mean, he wanted everyone to listen to him, but even his, I say that he helped bridge European avant-garde ideas with American audiences because even if he introduced these ideals to maybe 2 or 3 people, that's still expanding the movement of modernism itself. So, and I feel that he knew that as well. And then also a great drawing that André drew himself. André Smith makes too much noise, which we don't think so, but nevertheless. Well, that just flew by. Thank you. Do you guys have any questions? Yes?
Oh, good. You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
His leg amputated.
Mm-hmm.
Why? And did he have a prosthetic?
He did have a prosthetic. He unfortunately was hurt during basic training before he went into the military service. I was having a conversation earlier with one of my interns about the concept of artists going to war, but they still had to go through basic training. Kind of comical. I'm not sure they ever were thinking of rolling around in the mud. But unfortunately, he did get injured way back then, and just with medicine and their lack of knowledge, it festered. He went through many surgeries to try to keep his leg, but unfortunately, he did have it amputated. He did have a prosthetic, but he also did suffer from phantom limb for the remainder of his life. Not fun. He talks about it in some of his letters to Oscar, and they're actually heartbreaking because there's nothing he can do. It's just a pain that he's trying to overcome, and maybe that influenced his artwork as well. Of how do I express what I'm feeling? The idea of feeling something that doesn't exist, that you can't see, I think is interesting in juxtaposition with the kind of artist and the kind of artwork that he was making. Yes.
So that supports my first thought, which is that this is also the rise of psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And the unconscious is not a well-founded, scientific, and everybody accepts it.
Yeah.
And today we know, because we're enlightened,
Mm-hmm.
that the body and the somatic experience also impacts the unconscious.
Yeah.
So he was expressing a somatic experience
Yes.
through his non-realistic but expressive imagination
Mm-hmm.
that in our view today we can accept as normal because we've been so exposed to it.
Yes.
But I think what's interesting is at the same time there is something American. I mean, the Russian realists and the Russian avant-garde, they were doing this kind of work. But this has an American. And I'm kind of curious why he came to Florida from the Northeast.
It's a good question. By the time that his leg was amputated, it was much more difficult for him to travel. He did mention in one of his letters that going overseas to Europe, which he loved to winter in Europe, was just getting a little too much for him. And I think it was actually Oscar, we're still kind of piecing this together. A lot of these letters give us lots of answers, but also many more questions. But I think, Oscar may have talked about Florida, or someone recommended Florida. And he came here a couple times. He actually first went to Fort Lauderdale and hated it. which I find so interesting that he hated Fort Lauderdale, but was like, Maitland is where it's at. He loved Maitland. And then he was a snowbird. So even though he lived in Connecticut, he escaped for the winter. So I think once he was here and once he found, it's kind of a new way of expression. I mean, imagine you live up north and you came to Florida for the first time. It's a jungle like that. I can't even imagine, I don't even understand why people would vacation here. Maitland was apparently a very hot spot to vacation, which perplexes me. Not sure what anyone did, but it must have just been such an adventure. So, and we do see his artwork also was influenced by his time in Florida too. So I think it was just one of those things. He came down here, really kind of came to love it. And then of course, when Mary Bok is like, I'll give you money to build a museum, you stay in Florida. You stay and you build that museum.
Thank you, Mary.
Yes, thank you, Mary. Exactly.
That's our next t-shirt.
Yes.
Thank you, Mary.
Yes.
Is there any influence with the rise of jazz? I'm not familiar with the rise of jazz because I'm feeling improvisation of jazz.
Yes. So one of our favorite quotes of Andre's, which we'll go when we go through the exhibition, we will go through it then. It's a great quote. But he talks about jazz. He also, with his Toodles, very early on, in a letter to Oscar, he is describing how his Toodles, in a way, are also kind of depicting a symphony, if you will. Just the way that, even this little bit at the top, you can kind of see just the chaoticness of it. It does give jazz, it does give a destructive feeling to it, like someone's shaking you, listen to me.
Well, that key word you said from his quote, the word that said improvisation.
Yes, improvisation.
That's the key to jazz, is improvisation.
Yes.
That was a major tenet of modernism.
Yeah, that's what he's talking about.
Improvisation also improvisation has structure in it, and repetition.
Mhm.
Exactly.
And fractals, and all improvisation has structure. If you're not listening for it or seeing it, you're not aware of it. But once you spend time there, you see it and hear it and know it.
Yeah, and that's what's so, I think, fascinating about André Smith is he was really influenced by the change of the world around him, which I think is a choice. You can grow up and be comfortable with how you were raised and be comfortable with, whatever you're doing, but André really kind of put himself out there, and I think wanted to make himself uncomfortable to kind of figure this out, to search through his artistry and just his way of thinking. Yes.
I was just going to comment to the exchange of populations. American soldiers who found themselves in Europe and exposed to that culture, and to the different culture, but sometimes just sheer horror.
Right.
And then those refugees from Europe who came to the US in the 30s and 40s. And those kinds of exchanges had tremendous influence. And
Absolutely,
so, in a way, he's not victim because he did not allow himself to be victimized, but his experience was not one he would have chosen, I don't suppose. So it's interesting to see.
He was displaced, and then he created a place for himself.
Excellent point.
That's a
Absolutely.
wonderful way to put it, and it kind of ties back to the Espero, just losing your leg. He's in search of that place. He's in search of the hope, and then he eventually created it here. Yes.
But an extension of what Nancy said is, if this exchange had not happened, if he didn't get over to Europe to see art, and if the refugees didn't come over here, when would modernism have happened?
Exactly.
The States.
Yeah.
Anybody have?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But, at this point, America was very kind of like, this is what we do. This is the art. This is what we show. It did take them a lot longer than in Europe to kind of catch on. So that's a great point. It's like the butterfly effect. History is just full of butterfly effects. There's one thing that happens that will cause a whole chain of events to happen that makes, who we are today. Great
But
point.
maybe, even though I'm speaking too much, maybe.
That's why you're here.
I've talked enough. Keep going.
That's why you're speaking for a room.
Well, since I'm a person from the Northeast, who came to Florida, there's a quality of permission when you're not living in the traditionalism of the Northeast, which is very tied still to the old world.
Yeah.
You come down south, there's a tradition in the South, but it's not tied in the same way to Europe. So it gives you permission to be a little bit more experimental,
Yeah.
a little bit more risk-taking,
That's
a little
true.
bit more, who cares? No one
Yeah,
really is telling you what I can and cannot do.
Well, to some extent, you don't have as much to risk. You don't have a career,
Exactly.
you're in the middle of nowhere.
You don't have-
Creative freedom.
You don't have to
Yeah.
do the modern art.
Yeah.
You don't have curators judging you.
And
You
I
know,
will
the
say
one thing,
he,
oh, I'm sorry. Kate,
just
Yeah.
one thing to point out is, we always, even though as prolific as he was, he did come from a lot of privilege as well. So I think that also afforded him a lot of flexibility too. And he was a man, so.
True.
Dan?
No. Oh, great. No, the one thing,
And he was very dapper.
I was fortunate enough to work at a couple institutions, cultural institutions in New York, and, I worked with very brilliant people, and they were trying to convey to me, when we were talking about Cubism especially, and the Armory show of 1913, they were talking about how we can't understand the seismic shift of that in our current situation. Like, everything changes for us weekly, monthly, every 3 months there's a new art movement, and back then there was the old guard that had held sway there was subtle changes, but it had held sway for centuries
Yeah.
of representation, and all of a sudden you have this industrial revolution, you have this massive change in how people are seeing the world, psychology, art, and then you have the First World War.
Yeah.
And what it did is it just ripped
Everything up.
open society, and people were trying to find their footing. That's why when we go across the street, we'll talk about, how I felt, especially, based on Danny's writings and what I got from Katie, was what the war did to Andre.
Mm-hmm.
He was a person of privilege, but he was dramatically changed by his experience of the war in Europe.
Yeah.
And I
He
think
did not
that
like
was,
war.
that was a moment for him that started questioning. I think modernism begins with questioning.
Yeah.
What is, it was a questioning of religious tradition, it was a questioning of societal norms, it was a questioning of, what is the role of the artist in society? Is it just my role to depict the natural, or can I look inward?
Yeah.
All those things that were just key transitions, they all happened within a 20-year period, which was mind-blowing.
And to kind of go off on that, World War I, it's not like they called it World War I.
Right,
They thought
right.
it was the war to end all
Great War,
wars.
whatever, yeah.
And so, especially André Smith, who, in one of his letters to Oscar, he's talking about basic training, and he's just not enjoying it. He says, all they're teaching us is legal murder, and I don't like it.
Yeah.
So even before going into war, this was his stance. But imagine you go through this awful, horrible war, trench, all of it. And then, you're going through life, you're pushing through, and then World War II happens. And so imagine just kind of the dismay and disbelief, because I thought we already went through this. And so I find it especially interesting tying it back to his magic realism. He started that in 1946. He was trying to, again, we had gone through another world war, so he was trying again to make sense of the world around him. And he landed on magic realism, which is true, but is not.
Yeah.
So, again, he was really a person of the time. Yeah.
Katie, that was wonderful.
Thank you.